Today we're going to be looking at 10 of YouTube's top bleed builds for Elden Ring. Each of these builds was tested with our character's playthrough, which is at level 300 and on New Game +6. For each of these builds, we also had our respective stats maxed out. So for example, we had 99 Dex and 99 Arcane, or 99 Strength and 99 Arcane. Each of these builds was one that we found on YouTube that looked like it was either very powerful or really fun to use, and we will put links to each of those videos in the bio. We also tried to stay away from overly buffing these builds. We just tried to stick to 1 or 2 buffs that were specifically relevant to the build we're using. For each of these builds, we also include notes that we personally think could make the build better. And lastly, we are scoring these builds out of a scale of 40, delegating specific points to certain aspects of the build. These aspects include the aesthetic, the ease, fun, defense, PvP, open world, large bosses, agile bosses, lastly, average or common bosses. So coming in at number 10, we have the Nightmare build. Now this build isn't necessarily the most practical build, it's more focused on aesthetics, but it does have some pretty cool features. It's essentially a prelets charge build around the Keen Butcher's Knife with healing properties. So first off, we're gonna start with the agile bosses for the Nightmare build, and it is not good. You will find yourself running around the entire arena. Not a good build for agile bosses. I give it a 0. It works really well for average bosses because it's focused around the prelets charge. Any boss that you can proc bleed with the prelets charge on the ground is gonna work really well. Any boss that's flying in the air, jumping all over the place, you're really limited to just try and hit him with jump attacks, and the jump attacks with the Butcher's Knife are generally unsuccessful. And if you're going up against large bosses, this really depends on how skilled you are with landing successive prelets charge attacks. You're not going to do a lot of damage per strike, but if you can land several attacks in succession, you'll be healing while also dealing a large amount of damage. For all of those factors, we give it a 0 for agile bosses, a 5 for average bosses, and a 0 for large bosses. Open world is really where the Nightmare build thrives because you'll be able to run through areas knocking out units really quickly. Most open world units do not do well against a prelets charge, and by the end of those units, you will still have full health because you're healing the whole time. For those factors, we give it a 5 for the open world. When it comes to PvP with the Nightmare build, it is not good. We tested it out a few times and overwhelmingly it came up short. Pretty much everybody knows if your enemy is doing a prelets charge, you can just run the opposite direction until they run out of stamina and then strike. You're also vulnerable in a prelets charge because they can just run behind you and strike you. The gear setup makes you pretty squishy, and the jump attacks with the Butcher's Knife are very hard to land. It's kind of a straight down motion as opposed to a sweep or a reach. And for those factors, we give the Nightmare build a 1 out of 5 for PvP. For defense, there's not much to say when it comes to armor. You're wearing rags, and on top of that, when you do use the prelets charge, you're very vulnerable to attacks from almost any direction. And for those reasons, the Nightmare build gets a 1 out of 5 for defense. And lastly, we have our misc category. While the Nightmare build is really cool and interesting, it's actually not that effective, and therefore for me, it really wasn't that fun. Ease of use is pretty high. Since you're really relying on the prelets charge, it's essentially one move. You can also attain all of these items on a first playthrough with relative ease. And lastly, aesthetic, top notch. This thing looks terrifying and I love it. For those reasons, we give it a 1.5 out of 3 for fun, a 2 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, which brings the total for the Nightmare build at an 18.5 out of 40.
At number 9, we have the Reduvia build, which is going to be based off of the ESO build. This build is based off of this Reduvia Bloodblade Ash of War, which causes blood buildup probably faster than any other buildup in the game currently, and was buffed with the recent patch. Against bosses, it had a pretty difficult time, as most dagger builds do. You don't have very much reach with the daggers, but with the Ash of War, you are able to sling a Bloodblade, which does proc bleed very quickly. I would say that is the biggest strength to this build, and trying to melee is very difficult. For that, we are going to give it a 0 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 6 out of 10 for average bosses, and a 1 out of 3 for large bosses. Next is going to be the open world, which we gave a 3.5 out of 5. It has the same problems that it does with bosses, where you are up close and personal, which can make it challenging. However, the fast attack speed does make it pretty easy in certain scenarios as well. For PvP, we found some mild success. The quick attack speed made it very easy to get bleed procs out very quickly, and the range did help a lot in this build. Overall, we're going to give it a 4 out of 5. For defense, we are not limited by wearing specific armor pieces, except for, of course, the white mask, which we wear for all of these builds. Due to having to dual wield daggers for this build, you cannot block, leaving you very susceptible. However, because of the Ash of War being ranged, it does make it a little bit easier and less necessary to block. Overall, we're going to be giving this a 3 out of 5 for defense. Lastly, we have the miss category. Overall, I didn't find it too fun. Having to be super close range for most of your attacks and very susceptible did get a little tiring. The gear for this is pretty easy to obtain, unless you wanted to dual wield 2 Reduvias. It does require a second playthrough, but the first Reduvia is very early game. We enjoyed the aesthetic of a dagger build. We think it's really cool, even though it lacks performance. Overall, we give it a 2 out of 3. Bringing the Reduvia build to a 22.5 out of 40. Coming in at number 8 is the Jump Bleed build by Rage Gaming Videos. This is one of the most effective builds against overall bosses, and if it came down to just rating the damage, it would probably be in the top 3. The Jump build is based off of successive attacks, specifically while jumping with curved swords. Curved sword jump attacks are unique because you can get 4 attacks in with 1 strike. You also have the added bonus of potentially dodging abilities while you're jumping at the same time. For this build, you do need 2 curved swords, specifically the Scavenge curved swords, the Jump Talisman, which is the Claw Talisman, and the Raptor's Black Feathers. The fact that you are jumping constantly throughout this build actually gives you a little bit of an advantage and increases your evasiveness during these boss fights. Because your moves are quick and paired with a jump, it did really well against agile bosses, since you can just chase them down and your first attack would be your jump attack. For large bosses, this was very effective, as the larger hitbox made it easier to land all of your attacks while in midair. Overall, we give it a 3 out of 3 for agile, 3 out of 3 for large, and a 9 out of 10 for average bosses. For open world, the jump build came in a little short. When you do a jump attack, you get 4 hits off, and for a smaller enemy, it's actually really hard to land all 4 of those hits. And for that reason, we give it a 2 out of 5. For PvP, we tested this, and it does have the advantage of attacking very quickly, and its charge attacks are very easy to land. The jump attacks specifically can be a little bit challenging, but overall we give it a 3.5 out of 5. This build's defense is about as useful as a rainbow stone, 0 out of 5. Because you switch out your chest piece for the Raptor's Black Feathers, you're dual wielding and cannot block, and because you're susceptible in midair, we give it a 0 out of 5 for defense. For the miscellaneous category, overall I find this one to be extremely fun. Although it does have its challenging moments, we give it a 2 out of 3. This build is a little bit more challenging to obtain all of the items, since it does require a lot more setup to complete the build, and if you are going for the dual wield Scavenge sword, you do have to have a second playthrough done. Also, getting used to the jump attacks and using that as an evasive tool is a little bit tricky. For those reasons, we give it a 1 out of 3 for ease. Lastly, the aesthetic we find to be pretty awesome. The black feathers are really cool, and it pairs really well with these Scavenge swords. We give it a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the total to a 25.5 out of 40.
Coming in at number 7, we have the shield build. This one, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, is also a video from NizarGG, modified slightly. The shield build consists of the fingerprint shield combined with the bloody Hellas. The fingerprint shield builds up madness with strikes along with blood proc buildup, as long as the fingerprint shield is set to the blood or occult affinity. The Ash of War for the shield is the shield crash, and we use the bloody Hellas because it has a very high bleed proc and it can attack while blocking with the shield. The original build uses the fingerprint shield combined with the cross naginata, but what I found was the bloody Hellas was more useful because although the cross naginata has more of a reach, the bloody Hellas actually provides more than twice a bleed proc than the cross naginata. When it comes to agile bosses, the shield build is not very good because you have very poor range, and the Ash of War is extremely hard to land when they're just jumping around every 5 seconds. It works pretty well against average bosses like the Godskin Apostles or the Magma Worm, for example. And for large bosses, it does okay. You can proc a lot of damage, and for those reasons, we give it a 1 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 6 out of 10 for the average bosses, and a 2 out of 3 for the large bosses. For open world, the shield build is very effective. The shield crash acts as a block while you're attacking, and the Bloody Hellas can also be used as a thrusting attack while blocking, making you virtually indestructible in most open world situations. For those reasons, we give it a 5 out of 5. For PvP, the shield build actually came up a little bit short. Similar reasons to the agile bosses, you're very short ranged and your attack moves are very predictable. Also, blocking isn't very effective in most PvP scenarios, and for those reasons, we give it a 2.5 out of 5. For defense, the shield build is a no-brainer. The fingerprint shield combined with the Great Shield Talisman allows you to just absorb any physical damage with minimal effect to your stamina. You can attack while blocking in almost every situation. For those reasons, we give it a 5 out of 5 in defense. And lastly, for miscellaneous, the shield build is very fun to use. Any invader you come up against in the game is completely annihilated, and the Bloody Hellas procs bleed very quickly for a satisfying result. Ease of use, this is actually one of the harder builds to come together with. The fingerprint shield is very challenging to get, as well as the Bloody Hellas, and you need to get all the way to the underground sewers in Lendale just to get the shield. And lastly, aesthetic. I really enjoy it. I think the fingerprint shield is one of the more fun weapons you can get in the game. And for those reasons, we give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 0 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, which brings the shield build to a 26.5 out of 40.
At number 6, we have the Scythe build, which is built around the guide by Rage Gaming Videos. The spinning Scythe build is based off of using a scythe and the successive attacks that occur when using the spinning weapon Ash of War and the Blood Flame Blade spell. This build did a decent job against average bosses. You really thrive when you're able to stand right next to a boss for at least one full cast of the spinning weapon. The Ash of War is very effective against most bosses, especially bosses that are bigger because they have a larger hitbox, or multiple enemies that you can hit at the same time with the spinning weapon Ash of War. For these reasons, we give the Scythe build a 1 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 2 out of 3 for large bosses, and a 7 out of 10 for the average boss. Open world, this build performed pretty well. You can use the Ash of War and just simply let enemies walk right into you and shred them into pieces. This works just as well against one enemy as it does against groups, and for those reasons we give it a 3.5 out of 5. The Scythe build actually performed pretty well in PvP, although the Ash of War that it's built around was pretty challenging to get off. For those reasons, we give it a 3.5 out of 5. The defense of this build is not too bad. You are able to block with the Scythe for incoming damage, and the Ash of War doesn't lock you down for too much time like it does for other weapons. For those reasons, we give it a 3.5 out of 5 for defense. Lastly, we have the aesthetic. This build was extremely fun to play. I highly recommend it to anybody, even if you don't want to stick with the build. It was very aesthetically pleasing. I mean, you have a bloody on fire scythe that you're spinning around. It's probably one of the coolest combo abilities that you can use in the game, although it was a little bit challenging to obtain all of the required items for this build. The spinning weapon Ash of War you can get very early on, and the scythe you can get actually very early on as well. However, if you want to get the grave scythe, it does take a little bit of luck and some farming. And the incantation Blood Flame Blade you can also get very easily off of a scarab early game. For those reasons, we give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 1 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Scythe build to a 27.5 out of 40.
At number 5, we have Eleanor's Poleblade build from the channel Your Average Gamer. The build around Eleanor's Poleblade is based off of the Blood Blade Dance Ash of War combined with successive attacks. When it comes to bosses, your charge attacks are really strong, you're very agile, and you hit really fast with a pole blade. So for those reasons, we give it a 2 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 7 out of 10 for average bosses, and a 2 out of 3 for large bosses. Only downfall that we could find with the pole blade is that the Ash of War locks you in. If you don't land the Ash of War, you are set in a fixed moveset for a few extra seconds. When it comes to open world, the pole blade is tremendous. You mow down enemies, you can hit several enemies at the same time, and that Ash of War just annihilates people. For those reasons, open world gets a 5 out of 5. When it comes to PvP, I actually didn't think this would be that good, but it definitely is. If you can lock in your opponent in the Ash of War grind, you'll basically take him out in one use. It's also just generally really fast, and for those reasons, we give it a 4 out of 5. When it comes to defense, the pole blade is a pretty light weapon, which allows you to put on better armor. You can also block if you're two-handing the pole blade, and for those reasons, we give it a 3 out of 5. And lastly, for miscellaneous, the pole blade is very fun to use. Very cool. I love using the pole blade and twin blades in general in Elden Ring. And the Ash of War is just so satisfying. I highly recommend it. For ease, it's a little challenging to get. That's probably the worst part of the build, is that you have to fight Eleanor to get her pole blade. And as for aesthetic, this thing is awesome. I love it. Looks very cool. Ash of War looks awesome. For those reasons, we give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 1 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, which brings the pole blade to a 30 out of 40. Number 4 is the Rivers of Blood build, which is loosely based off of the build by Cyrobe. The Rivers of Blood build is based on the Corpse Piler Ash of War and successive attacks. I think it's pretty common knowledge at this point that the Rivers of Blood is a very successful weapon against most bosses. For those reasons, we give it a 2 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 9 out of 10 for average bosses, and a 2.5 out of 3 for large bosses. When it comes to open world, it's great. It's really awesome. I highly recommend it. The Ash of War is a very good reach. It takes people out very quickly and it procs bleed very fast. Katanas are very satisfying weapons to use. And for those reasons, we give it a 4 out of 5 for open world. When it comes to PvP, same thing. Rivers of Blood is a very successful weapon in PvP. I like to dual wield them. They're great. Like, I don't really know what else to say. For those reasons, we give it a 5 out of 5 in PvP. Since this build was dual wielding the Rivers of Blood, we did take a hit in our defense because of the lack of ability to block and the shorter range. And for those reasons, we lowered it down to a 2 out of 5 for defense. And lastly, for miscellaneous, the Rivers of Blood is a really fun weapon to use. Everybody loves it. Let me solo her, uses one. It's fantastic. As far as ease, it's a relatively easy build to get used to using and playing with, but it is a little bit challenging to get the actual weapon itself. You have to go all the way to the snow, which is the last part of the game. And then if you want to dual wield them, you have to do a second playthrough no matter what. Aesthetic, we think, is pretty cool. Dual wielding 2 red swords is always going to look cool with almost any armor set. And for those reasons, we give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 1.5 out of 3 for ease, and a 2 out of 3 for aesthetic, which brings the Rivers of Blood build to a 31 out of 40.
For number 3, we have the Greatstars build. This is a build that we've been using and testing ourselves for quite some time. The Greatstars build is built off of having at least 1 Greatstars, but we prefer having 2, and the Stormcaller Ash of War, which causes you to spin around rapidly, and for every single attack that you hit, you can build Bleed Up, Poise Break, and Healing. The Greatstars build is also unique in that it's the only weapon in this list that offers strike damage. Against bosses, this performs very well with the exception of agile bosses, since the Stormcaller Ash of War does lock you into a position, and if you're spinning and they jump away, you miss out on the entire Ash of War use. Other than that, dual wielding the Greatstars, it does build up bleed very quickly and causes a lot of poise break at the same time. For these reasons, we give it a 1 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 3 out of 3 for large bosses, and an 8.5 out of 10 for the average boss. For open world, the Greatstars build absolutely dominates. You can just sit there and use your Stormcaller Ash of War and it will shred any enemy coming near you. The healing over time adds up very well. For these reasons, we give it a 5 out of 5 for open world. For PvP, we thought that this would perform very poorly. If you are able to land your Stormcaller, it will quickly end the match. For these reasons, we give it a 3 out of 5 for PvP. For defense, we gave this a little bit of a higher rating. Even though we are dual wielding and can't block, we do have a constant heal that is coming in while we're attacking, and the Stormcaller Ash of War makes it to where no enemy can really get close to you without staggering themselves in the process. For this reason, we give it a 3.5 out of 5 for defense. Lastly, we have the miscellaneous category. This build is extremely fun to play and very easy to get used to. The benefits of the heal for every hit and the Stormcaller Ash of War makes cutting through the game very easy with this build. Because this build is very easy to get used to and very powerful on average, I did have a lot of fun playing this build. You can get both Greatstars very easily without defeating any major bosses, making it one of the easiest builds to obtain all the items for. For these reasons, we give it a 2.5 out of 3 for fun, we give it a 3 out of 3 for ease, and a 2.5 out of 3 for aesthetic, bringing the Greatstars build to a 32 out of 40.
Coming in at number 2, we have the Naga Kiba build, another build by Rage Gaming. The Naga Kiba build is based off of the Naga Kiba katana. We accompany it with the Blood Flame and the double slash Ash of War, which is basically what the Rivers of Blood uses as well. The Naga Kiba is a ridiculously long sword, and it makes you look like you're overcompensating for something by using it. When it comes to bosses, this thing is an absolute powerhouse against agile bosses, average bosses, and large bosses. You're gonna have a great time using this thing if you need to murder someone. The Ash of War gives this already ridiculously long weapon even more range. On top of that, most bosses are susceptible to bleed. For those reasons, we give it a 2.5 out of 3 for agile bosses, an 8 out of 10 for average bosses, and a 3 out of 3 for large bosses. When it comes to open world, goes without saying again, the massive range on this weapon combined with the bleed and the high damage that it deals already makes this just a phenomenal weapon. Open world gets a 4 out of 5 for the Naga Kiba. When it comes to PvP, the Naga Kiba is phenomenal. Fast attack speed combined with long reach, basically the same reasons we just listed above. We're gonna give it a 4 out of 5. When it comes to defense, we really like this thing because we two-hand it, therefore we get the ability to block. It's also relatively light, so you can put on a decent amount of heavy armor. And for those reasons, we give it a 4 out of 5. For the miscellaneous category, this thing is so fun to use. I actually liked using it more than the Rivers of Blood because it looks ridiculous. It's taller than you. Who doesn't want to use a sword that's taller than you? It's very easy to use, and it's also easy to obtain. It's the same quest line as Eleanor's pole blade, but you don't have to kill Eleanor to get it. And lastly, the aesthetic. I think it's hilarious, but ultimately it doesn't look like it's supposed to be a part of the build, if that makes sense. It does look pretty cool with the Blood Flame incantation added because, I mean, look at it. For those reasons, we give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 3 out of 3 for ease, and a 1 out of 3 for aesthetic, which puts the Naga Kiba at a solid 32.5 out of 40. And the number 1 best bleed build that we could find on YouTube was the Moog Staff build by, once again, the Average Gamer. The Moog Staff build is based off of the Blood Boon ritual, which causes fire damage and blood loss buildup. Using this Ash of War even just once will coat your weapon in Blood Flame, which increases fire damage and blood loss buildup from your regular melee strikes, like stabbing them in the face. The Ash of War consists of 3 strikes, and if you can get the 3rd strike in, it causes more damage than the other 2 strikes combined. This build is ridiculously overpowered in pretty much every sense. The Ash of War is insane. It procs bleed ridiculously fast. It can attack enemies in all directions around you and through walls. Every boss that's susceptible to bleed is completely annihilated by this build. Its weaknesses are the Gargoyles, the Elden Beast, and Moog himself. Moog Staff also does fall a little bit short when it comes to really agile bosses like Malekith. For those reasons, we give it a 1 out of 3 for agile bosses, a 10 out of 10 for average bosses, and a 3 out of 3 for large bosses. When it comes to the open world, Moog Staff is one of my favorite weapons to use personally. It is the fastest way to clear pretty much any area in the game with relative ease. The talismans make this weapon super overpowered, and you have a very large attack range. If you're dual wielding Moog Staff, it's just even more powerful. For those reasons, we give it a 5 out of 5 in open world. When it comes to PvP, Moog Staff is also a very versatile weapon. It kind of goes without saying. For the reasons listed above in bosses and open world, it is equally as effective in PvP. We're going to give this a 4.5 out of 5 for this category. It's a little bit heavy, which is going to require you to put on lighter weight armor. And if you're dual wielding it, obviously you can't block. The real downside for defense here is that when you're using the Ash of War, you are completely locked in, and if an enemy is attacking you with a ranged attack, you are very vulnerable. For those reasons, we give it a 2 out of 5 for defense. And lastly, for the miscellaneous, it goes without saying, Moog Staff, I think personally, is one of the most fun weapons you could possibly use. You will literally melt almost every single boss. It's insane. In seconds, they're destroyed. When it comes to ease, the hardest part is really just getting the weapon. You do have to kill Moog himself to get the staff, which can be a little bit challenging, but the gameplay mechanics of it is very easy. And the aesthetic, I mean, this is one of the most badass Ashes of War that you use in the game. You're stabbing the air and showering yourself in your enemy's blood as they fall victim to your wrath around you. For those reasons, we give it a 3 out of 3 for fun, a 2 out of 3 for ease, and a 3 out of 3 for aesthetic, which puts Moog Staff at number 1 with a 33.5 out of 40. And those are the top 10 bleed builds that we came across for Elden Ring. Let us know what you thought in the comments, if you disagree with anything, or if you felt like something could have been added to any of these builds to make them way better. Let us know in the comments. And let us know what you thought of our rating scale. Do you guys agree with how things were rated? Do you think we treated some less fairly over others? Or do you think we missed out on some categories that would have added to this counting system? Let us know below. We're going to be doing several more of these videos in different niche categories. So if you have any suggestions, let us know, and stay tuned for more.